In any case, we were talking about Geisler Rohan going to Australia and describing what he called the delayed infancy that he found among these folks, that humans have a longer time of dependency upon adults than we do, say, in the United States and in Europe. And he found that these kinds of things and other kinds of traumas too produced a particular certain kind of personality of these folks. He was one of the first to actually say a culture could have a personality. Just as a human being could have a personality, so could also a culture. And it was these kinds of ideas that later folks were in the so-called culture and personality movement kind of took this ball and tried to score a touchdown with it. And the big trifecta of the beginning, or the early days of the American Culture and Personality School, two other folks we need to mention. One was already Ruth Benedict. We'll talk about her more in a second, but we should mention another person in the Ménage à Trois, and I say this literally, was Edward Sapir, the person whose picture is on my wall in the office, probably the best and most well-known and maybe the best linguist of the early part of the 20th century, to be sure, until Chomsky came along. He was the first to describe unconscious patternings, unconscious configurations of grammar. The idea, for example, that we really don't know our language, or at least we don't know the rules of our language. We speak it correctly, we follow the rules. We know our grammar, but probably most of us would be really hard-pressed to actually give a real rule of the grammar, or explain how it works, or really explain how English actually operates. Okay? And from this, he kind of extended this notion of the unconscious, then beyond the linguistic limitations that it might have, into the idea of the personality, how the personality can become configured. And it was Ruth Benedict, another colleague and friend of the three, took this idea of the basic configurations of a culture, and again, it carried this to its logical extreme, to its logical conclusion. And so she saw how differences among cultures between rituals and beliefs and preferences and things like that, how they all, again, kind of express a personality, if you will, that a culture might have. Not just what a person may have, but what a culture might have. Okay. Again, as I showed you or mentioned before, both Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead appeared on U.S. stamps. They were, honored in any number of ways, but this is just one. Okay. And they were certainly the two most famous proponents of this idea that the growth and development of personal social identity relates to a surrounding social environment. Okay. Today, in psychology classes, we might call this the nurture versus the nature debate. That is, how much of the personality is a product of our genetics, and how much our heredity, how much of our personality is a product of where we grow up, our family, and our culture, if you will. How much are we influenced by our surrounding areas? Okay. And of course, as I said before, Ruth Benedict was a TA teaching at Barnard, the assistant to Franz Boas. And at this point, she meets Margaret Mead, and they become quite involved. And we see that Margaret Mead eventually decides to become a major in anthropology, become a student of Boas, and so on. And Ruth Benedict, of course, went on to do a lot of research, and she's probably most well known for two books, which we'll talk about today really briefly. The first one, and this is the more important one for our purposes, though they are related to the other one too, is a book called Patterns of Culture, written in 1934. And basically what she talked about in this book, Patterns of Culture, was the primacy of culture over biology and understanding the differences between people. And in this book, what she did, she took 4 exemplar societies that she thought were representative of some different kind of personalities that are out there. The Zuni, the Dobu, the Plains Indians, and the Kwakiutl, the Indians on the northwest coast. And she talked about how vastly different their personalities were. So it wasn't just a matter that there were cultural differences, that people had different kinds of subsistences, different kinds of kinship systems, different kinds of this and that, different kinds of languages. Instead, she was saying the personalities of the culture are configured in very different ways. And let's just briefly kind of talk about what she was getting at. The first group she described were the Zuni. And the Zuni, to put in 25 words or less, it's control, it's restraint, it's cerebral, okay? So it's not like a Daytona Beach party. Instead, would it be more like maybe a Boston Tea Party and an old club where people are or drinking sherry after a meal, and everybody's talking very sedately, very calmly. Okay, and so it's not a culture of extremes. In fact, excesses are frowned upon. Excess wealth, like you see, here's a sign of greed. Individual fame or attention, again, is thought to be rather unbecoming as a sign of being selfish. And so to kind of keep down this maybe natural feel that people might have to become rich or to become famous or whatever, become a celebrity, we see that there are solutions in the culture that the Zuni practice, that wealth is much more shared than we find in other groups, especially America. And for the most part, we kind of like stay out of, out of the spotlight for the most part. We don't want to. The Japanese have a phrase, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. You don't want to be the nail that gets hammered down. So compared to other cultures, and compared to certainly the other three cultures that she talked about in this book, these folks are extremely passive. Okay. And I think they stand out more starkly when you see the kind of other description she gives for the other society she talks about. Okay, the Dobu. Okay, the Dobu in the Pacific. Here we see they're dour and they're passionate in a sense. They're very jealous and suspicious and they're resentful. And everything that somebody else has, they're jealous of, and there's some unfairness about all this. And of course, everything we own ourselves, we get ourselves is for our own benefit. Okay, and the world is very malicious. Okay, it's a very dangerous world out there. It's kind of like what's kind of going on right now. I mean, people, why is somebody buying 64 rolls of toilet paper? In one sense, it's just because I can't have any. Well, the joke's on them. I have the bed. So imagine that same kind of attitude that Americans seem to be having now a little bit, this idea of paranoia and suspicion and resentment. But imagine that, permanently, not just through the time when we're having a disease to deal with, but instead imagine this is your whole life. You're born into this culture, you grew up in this kind of environment, and you start thinking of the world in these terms. So it's natural for you to be paranoid. It's natural for you to think that others are out to get you, in a sense. They're trying their best to, as you are to them. And so this is how she describes this culture. So, again, also too, if you can best somebody, either in an argument or whatever, okay, that's good because it shows you're the better person. Okay, so in a sense, she calls them paranoid. Okay, they're or perhaps even mean-spirited if you wanted to put a pejorative spin on it. Okay, certainly a very different culture than you find, at least in her description of the Zuni, the Pueblo Indians. Okay. Now the Great Plains, okay, so we're talking now the kind of hunters that you would see like in cowboy movies back in the 1950s and 60s. Here, and you probably got this idea too just from watching the cowboy movies because you see these characteristics being exaggerated and stereotyped. But you see wild abandon. People, they go to war with great fanfare. They paint themselves up and they howl and they have war dances and things. And so it's a matter of letting go. Many times is we don't really see so much this in the 1950s cowboy movies, but anthropologists will tell us that, for example, in terms of shamanistic rituals and things, there was a lot of drug taking going on, or states to kind of get you in ecstasy or to kind of find your ally. And so drinking and things, fertility rituals, orgies, all these kind of holy experiences and religious experiences were all part of this idea of abandon. Okay, and so it's not a culture like the Zuni that you hold back. Okay, if somebody offends you, it's a confrontation. Okay, so again, there's a lack of control as opposed to the Pueblo Indians, where it's all control. Okay. And the last group that she talks about, okay, is very similar to the Plains Indians. That's another Indian or Native American group. And these are the Kwakiutl. For those of you who remember from Anthropology 380, this was the group that Franz Boas really made his fame in his early works in the early part of the 20th century. These folks that live in the northwest coast, north of Washington, west coast of Canada, up through maybe Alaska even. Okay, and here we see if you remember from our description of the potlatch, okay, the potlatch economic game, the monopoly game of the Northwest Coast, these folks are megalomaniacs. They strive for advancement. They strive for besting each other. In fact, the whole potlatch ceremony, in a sense, is an attempt to kind of gain face and make the other person look bad and lose face. This overzealousness and this quest for fame is something, again, very, very different than you might find that the Zuni would be taking in. So it's, again, this idea of ecstasy, of being a braggart, okay, self-aggrandizement. These kinds of things were rather typical of the Kwakiutl, according to Ruth Benedict. Okay, so she gave them all nicknames, basically kind of going back to the Greeks to kind of describe a little bit of their personalities. So the Pueblo Indians were for the Apollonians, representing order and constraint and calm. These, again, going back to Greek characters in Greek plays. Okay, the Dionysians were the Plains Indians, wildness, abandon, letting go. Uses the Freudian term to talk about the folks in Dubu. They're paranoid, they're suspicious, they're distrustful, they're obsessive. And the Kwakiutl are the megalomaniacs, okay? In terms of manic depressives, these are the manic sides. They have very little, depressive sides. They're manics on steroids for the most part. So emotions are magnified, delusions of grandeur, sulking, suicidal, and again, it's a quest for face and one-upsmanship that characterizes that society. Okay, so what was the takeaway for all this back in the 1930s? Because again, Ruth Benedict, as many anthropologists had back in the 1920s and 1930s, she also had a literary bent. She was another really good writer. Probably not quite as good a stylist as Margaret Mead in her descriptions, but also very, very good. I mean, than your typical average anthropologist. Certainly many of them of today. And so she was writing as much for the layperson as she would be writing for specialists as well. She felt that other Americans and other people in Europe too had something to learn from what she was saying. And she was making an argument that basically, as we call nature nurture today, she was arguing that human nature is not fixed. And the reason why we see these different kinds of cultures is because human nature and the human personality is quite plastic. And the example would be is something probably everybody knows today. You could take some person from another foreign culture, United States, and of course you're going to see that they're going to want a car when they're 16 years old.